Like many of his fellow revolutionaries, Trotsky had given up hope of imminent upheaval in Russia, so he was stunned to read of the events of February 1917. With the abdication of the Tsar Nicholas, the political moment he had worked for across 2 decades had unexpectedly taken place without him, spurring him to return home immediately to help shape Russia's political future. He wrote in his autobiography,
"When I telephoned my wife from the newspaper office that Petrograd was in the midst of revolution, the younger boy was in bed with diphtheria. He was 9 years old, but he realized definitely, and had for a long time, that revolution meant an amnesty, a return to Russia, and 1,000 other blessings. He jumped to his feet and danced on the bed in honor of the revolution. It was a sign of his recovery."
Booking tickets on the Norwegian passenger ship Christiania Fjord, Trotsky made it out of the port of New York City with his family, but the ship didn't carry them across the Atlantic. Instead, British officers pulled Trotsky's family and 5 other passengers suspected to be revolutionaries off the boat. Though the Great War was underway, and political radicals were considered dangerous, Trotsky and company weren't subjects of an enemy nation. They were citizens of Russia, a country allied with the British war effort. No arrest papers were produced. Technically, there were no grounds to detain them. In the chapter of his autobiography titled "In a Concentration Camp," Trotsky later described the scene in which he was roughed up and then fingerprinted by the detectives as his son's first lesson in British democracy. During his month in Nova Scotia, Trotsky slept with hundreds of prisoners in an open room of a decommissioned iron foundry, run by a veteran of Britain's Boer Wars who had no sympathy for Trotsky's revolutionary agenda.
The whole month I was there was like one continuous mass meeting. I told the prisoners about the Russian Revolution, about Liebknecht, about Lenin. The British colonel forbade me to make any more public speeches. But this did not happen until the last few days of our stay at the camp, and served only to cement my friendship with the sailors and workers, who responded to the colonel's order by a written protest bearing 530 signatures. A plebiscite like this, carried out in the very face of Sergeant Olson's heavy-handed supervision, was more than ample compensation for all the hardships of the Amherst imprisonment.
Outside the camp, news of Trotsky's arrest appeared in the New York Times and spread to the Russian capital. The British ambassador there declared Trotsky a paid agent of Germany, while revolutionary parties denied the charge and insisted that Russia demand his freedom. The leading ministers of Russia's first provisional government were not themselves revolutionaries. Aware of the threat Trotsky posed and his refusal to accept their legitimacy, they felt less sympathy for his plight. But they recognized the need to garner support from the left, and after weeks of stalling, the government caved and requested Trotsky's release. Trotsky declared his solidarity with Lenin that July. If Trotsky missed the first revolution of 1917, he made up for it by plotting the second. After a 6-week prison stay for abetting an attempt to overthrow the government, he rallied the local workers and built support among war-weary soldiers frustrated with Russian involvement in the Great War. No one did more to mobilize Bolshevik supporters for armed insurrection. After Trotsky masterminded military strategy during the Bolshevik seizure of power that fall, the nullification of election results months later scuppered any possibility of a democratic Russia. His presence in the Bolshevik rise to power and establishment of the Russian revolutionary state is so outsized that it becomes hard to imagine the same history unfolding in his absence. The pamphlet in British captivity became a mandatory part of the Red Army's traveling library during the Russian Civil War. As much as Trotsky hated his detention, it later inspired him to recommend a similar approach to his fellow revolutionaries. In June 1918, he suggested putting a group of problematic prisoners of war in a concentration camp. This was not unusual. Prisoners of war were being held at that moment all around the world. A few days later, however, he delivered a memo in which he proposed that it might be advisable to put members of the bourgeoisie in camps too, doing menial work, cleaning barracks, camps, streets, digging trenches, just the kind of jobs he himself had been required to do at Amherst. Camps were soon effectively in use in several places, though it would be years before the network would fully fuse with the Russian tradition of forced labor. By imagining the camps as holding pens not just for enemy aliens during a time of war, but also for any fellow citizens who were in some way suspect, he transformed these camps into a tool by which a government could exert control over its own citizens without due process. Including concentration camps as a part of revolutionary strategy, Trotsky ensured that they could also be a tool of political reconstruction. During the decades that followed, In states such as the People's Republic of China, North Korea, and Cambodia, preemptive civilian relocation and detention would become a defining feature of revolutionary quote-unquote justice.